hear me clearly. If anybody has got any issues, just let me know in the chat box and I'll see if I can sort them out as we go along. Just as an opening note, I've disabled the microphone option. As much fun as it is to have everybody shouting over each other, it's a lot easier for me if we can just use the chat box on the left-hand side. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time by typing in the chat box, and I'll be happy to answer these at the end of the presentation. I'm sure everybody can learn from any of the questions asked. So right, let's get started. Understanding subsistence allowance. Subsistence allowance can seem straightforward, but there are aspects to it that can get confusing. So let's take a look. What are my options? Travel is a part of business life. When I do traveling for business, the company must cover my accommodation and meals. This can be done in two ways. The company either pays for the accommodation and meals directly, so I don't have to worry about settling any bills, or I can get an allowance or advance to cover the expenses of the trip. Alternatively, I can also be reimbursed for any expenses that happen. At Paymaster People Solutions, we routinely receive at least one "Please explain subsistence allowance" questions from our clients, who usually send us their questions using our live website chat facility or by the normal option such as email or telephone call. Based on our clients' questions, seemingly the deemed rate and actual payment of expenses against the receipts that are submitted by the employees causes a great deal of unhappiness. Mostly the employers, who should be you guys, consider processing travel claim reimbursements in excess of the deemed rate to be far too beneficial for your employees, even though this is a tax-deductible claim for the employer. On the other hand, more often than not, employees are of the view that they deserve to be reimbursed for the full amount, owing to the added inconvenience of being away from home. SARS has a document on subsistence allowance, but it causes a lot of confusion. It's got a lot of big words, and they managed to put the sentences in such a way that it's very difficult to understand. What is an allowance? What is a reimbursement? Let's have a look at some of the definitions so that we can make that a little bit clearer. So an allowance. An allowance is an amount of money granted by the employer to an employee to incur business-related expenditure on behalf of the employer, without an obligation to the employee to prove or account for the business-related expenditure to the employer. The amount of the allowance is based on anticipated business-related expenditure. So what happens is the company will say to the employee, right, we're going to give you an allowance of 300 Rand a day or 500 Rand a day while you're away. And then the employee has got pretty much free rein access to use it for accommodation or meals, and they don't have to then report back to the employer on how they spent that money. An advance. An advance is an amount of money granted by an employer to an employee to incur business-related expenses on behalf of the employer, with an obligation on the employee to prove or account for the business-related expenditure to the employer. The amount of the advance is based on the anticipated business-related expenditure. The employer recovers the difference from the employee if the actual expenses incurred are less than the advance granted, and vice versa. So in this case, the employee has to have slips and prove to the employer how much money was spent, and then either will refund the company or the employee will be given the difference so that he's not out of pocket. And lastly, we have reimbursement. A reimbursement of business-related expenditure occurs when an employee has incurred and paid for business-related expenses on behalf of an employer without having had the benefit of an allowance or an advance, and is subsequently reimbursed for the exact expenditure of the employer after having proved and accounted for the expenditure to the employer. So in this case, the employee would spend the money first, bring the slips in to the employer, and then be reimbursed for the amounts that they spent. So now that the words that are being used are a bit easier to understand, how does this get treated in your company? What does your company policy say, and what is in the contract of employment? This will form the basis for paying the employee whilst away from home on work-related business activity. For example, does your company pay for hotels, meals, And please make sure you stipulate a maximum value, otherwise you can be completely taken advantage of. And for incidental expenses. In all cases, be very sure to clarify meaning and understanding. For example, are parking related costs considered an incidental expense? Or how does your company view the purchase of something like a cool drink and a chocolate bar? Make this very clear to avoid problems arising during the claim reimbursement process. A possible company policy clause might resemble something along the following. You will be required to spend some nights away from home. The company will pay for your accommodation up to the value of X amount and meals up to the value of X amount. In addition, an allowance of 122 Rand per night will be paid to cover incidental costs like chocolates, cool drinks, etc. No additional reimbursement claims will be paid out. No reimbursement claim document needs to be completed. So let's have a look at what the law actually says. A subsistence allowance is an allowance given to an employee in respect of incidental costs incurred when away from home and doing company business for at least one night, which is considered sunset to sunrise. When the employer pays for the hotel and meals, a subsistence allowance of 122 Rand per night may be claimed. This is also known in the SARS document as the deemed rate. Where the employer only pays for the accommodation, the allowance of 397 Rand per night, the deemed rate. Where breakfast is included in the rate, then the breakfast is regarded as part of the accommodation rate. So the employee cannot claim that they had to pay for breakfast if it was part of the accommodation. So let's look at how to pay subsistence allowance. Before providing an explanation of the process to be followed when paying a subsistence allowance, please take note of the following warning. A subsistence allowance will not form part of the employee's remuneration package and should therefore be paid over and above the employee's normal remuneration. And no employee's tax should be deducted from this amount, even if the amount exceeds the deemed rate. You are not allowed to include a subsistence allowance as part of your employee's package. SARS gets really upset if they see it on RP5 submissions, and the employee often has to end up paying in extra tax because SARS will tell them that they cannot claim it as a tax-free option under subsistence if it's part of their monthly package. It has to be stipulated when the employee is actually away for business. So just to make your employees' lives easier, please do not make it part of the package. So what will happen is the employee will then, when it goes to the payroll, it should be indicated on the RP5, and SARS will make the required adjustments when the employee submits their tax return. There are only two real ways to pay out subsistence allowance. Number one is to ask your employee for the expense slips and to reimburse your employee. These are not subject to employee's tax. So subsistence allowance is tax-free on the payroll. Or you can pay out the subsistence allowance as prescribed by SARS, which you would then use the deemed rate. No expense slips are required here either. These are not subject to employee's tax unless their amounts exceed the deemed rate. Then the employee will be taxed on the difference unless receipts for the full amount can be produced. So any tax that is calculated on subsistence allowance will only be done on the submission of the employee's tax certificate to SARS when they do their own tax return. There is no tax calculated on subsistence allowance on the payroll at all. There is nothing I can find that prevents the employer and employee from determining their own methods of processing claims for each trip. However, this might result in an administrative nightmare if employees are left to decide on their preferred method of submitting reimbursement claims. Therefore, it is suggested that the following payslip RP5 codes are used. When the deemed, which is the claimable rate, is exceeded, make use of the code 3704 for local travel or 3715 for international travel. And when the deemed claimable rate is not exceeded, make use of the code 3705 for local and code 3716 for international. Most payroll systems will have these codes automatically programmed, so you should just be able to select the subsistence allowance option and then just make sure your codes are correct. The employee will then complete the RP5 and submit the annual return. And then based on this RP5, SARS will then make the required adjustments, if there are any. Please note, the supporting documents for any expense claim should be archived for a period of 5 years. You don't want to be caught by SARS not having your backup documents, otherwise the employer will just be forced to pay in the extra tax should SARS require it. So let's have a look at a case study. So one of the questions we often get asked is, if my expenses claim is less than the deemed rate, or if my company reimburses me less than the redeemed rate, what happens? What are my options? So at the end of the day, the only thing you can do is submit your RP5 to SARS. They will then make the required adjustments on your return. So what would happen is if you have been under reimbursed for your subsistence allowance, then SARS will give you that money back when you do your tax return. The company cannot make any adjustments or give you any tax relief via the payroll system for any unclaimed or underclaimed subsistence allowance. So you'll have to take that up with SARS. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, Laurie is asking, does this mean that the daily deemed rates must be paid based on actual qualifying nights rather than a fixed amount per month? Laurie, yes, that's correct. If your employee is traveling, it would have to be for the nights that they are away. You cannot give them a fixed amount per month. Unless they are specifically away for those days in the month and it works out to the same amount, you would have to give them the amount based on the days that they are away. If you are short paying them and they are actually due for more because of the amount of time they're spending away, then they can claim that when they do the RP5. Does anybody else have any questions? Hi, yes, Adele. I see you asking for the email address. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send a copy of the presentation to everybody that's attended. What you can then just do is just respond to the email and just request an attendance certificate, and we'll make sure you get a copy. You are welcome, Adele. Okay, Laurie says, I also understand that in order to qualify, one night needed to be spent away, yet if one was away for 2 days and 1 night, then 2 days could be claimed. Laurie, you are correct. You can claim for the 2 days, but you cannot have it as a standard monthly amount. You do need to then claim it for the days that you are actually away. Trigeta is asking if the company only pays 300 Rand per day, should they reimburse you for the other 97 Rand? What I suggest you do is bring it to the attention of whoever does the payments that it should be 397 Rand per day, so that going forward you can be paid the correct amount. Otherwise, what happens is you're going to have to claim the missing 97 Rand from SARS when you do your tax return. So the best thing to do is just make sure that they're aware that it should be 397 Rand, so that you don't then get short paid. It's a lot easier to get paid correctly through the payroll than it is to try and claim it from SARS. So that's probably going to be your best bet. Right, if nobody else has any questions, thank you so much for your time today and for listening to me rattling on about subsistence allowance. Everybody's going to get a copy of the presentation. Should you need a attendance certificate, just respond to the email requesting one, and we'll be more than happy to supply one. Thanks very much, and have a great day.